when Pope Francis appointed a woman for the first time to serve as the Undersecretary for the Synod of Bishops. Her name was Sister Nathalie Beccar, a French woman. The Pope was not doing anything really unusual. The female saint whose feast we are celebrating today played an even more important role in the Catholic Church than being Undersecretary for the Synod of Bishops, Saint Catherine of Siena, Doctor of the Church. She was responsible for the return of the papacy to Rome after residing in the city of Avignon in France for almost 7 decades. And you know, she was just 30 years old when she went out of her way to write letters to popes and cardinals and bishops and even to kings and queens. And she pestered them really so that they would help in restoring the papacy in Rome as the symbol of unity of the universal church. Imagine the Pope, back then, Pope Gregory the 11th, appointing this young woman, 30 years old, to serve as papal legate to facilitate a dialogue between Avignon and Florence in order to mediate their political conflicts so that they could return the papacy in Rome. Saint Catherine succeeded in her task, but the return eventually led to an even greater problem. After Pope Gregory the 11th died, a new pope, Pope Urban VI, was elected. But his policies became so unpopular, they pressured him to resign. And when he refused to resign, they elected another pope who lived in Avignon and caused a terrible division in the Catholic Church. And this is now called the Great Schism, which would last for 39 years. One of these days, I suggest that you Google this Great Schism to understand that episode in church history. Saint Catherine was instrumental in getting all the other church leaders to eventually recognize, even decades after her death, that in spite of the human flaws and weaknesses, the bishop who occupied the Holy See in Rome had primacy and was meant to serve as the legitimate pope, not anybody else. Well, St. Catherine suffered much in the last years of her life, and she offered her devastating disease as a participation in the Passion of Christ, believing that the wound of division in the body of Christ could only be healed by an enormous sacrifice on her part. She also received the marks of the wounds of Christ, which are called stigmata, the same marks, that Saint Francis of Assisi received. And you know what? She died at exactly the same age Jesus did, 33 years old. Well, today's readings make us realize that the problems of internal conflicts and division within the church have always been present since the very first day, since the start. In the gospel, right at the Last Supper, Jesus would be speaking about the first person who would desert him, Judas Iscariot. In the first reading, St. Luke tells us that their mission companion, John, who was called Mark, deserted them. The fact that he went straight to Jerusalem and not to Antioch, which was supposed to be their church of origin, could only mean that maybe John Mark was not comfortable with Paul's aggressive style of evangelizing and welcoming the Gentiles into the young church. At that time, the leaders in Jerusalem, headed by James, were not yet open to baptizing Gentile converts to Christianity unless they were circumcised and were willing to become Jews first. The terrible conflict between the pro-James faction and the pro-Paul faction was eventually settled through a dialogue in the Council of Jerusalem, through the facilitation of cooler heads like St. Peter. Up to now, the Church continues to address issues like this through dialogue, in synods and councils where people could honestly express their opinions and perhaps even their disagreements and still remain as brothers and sisters. Pwede naman yun eh. We can have disagreements and still respect each other. Dialogue ang tawag dito. Dialogue has always been the key to the resolution of many conflicts in the church since the very beginning. It was also the approach of St. Catherine of Siena, whose best-known work or writing was entitled Dialogue of Divine Providence. You know, there will never be a time in history when we will not be confronted by similar problems that have to do with the humanity, the weaknesses of the church as an institution. And like any human institution, we will always have to learn how to deal with tendencies towards division and how to do conflict management. It was St. Paul who first described the organic unity of the church as the body of Christ. Hindi naman laging kailangang negative ang division. Division can also be a signal for growth. Sa katawan ng tao, merong healthy cells, pero meron ding cancerous cells. When the cancerous cells divide, they metastasize and become more toxic and destructive. But when the healthy cells divide, the body grows and heals itself. On this feast day of a great woman, Catherine of Siena, who acted like a good antibody within the body of Christ, let our prayer be that our divisions be only for growth, never for the disintegration of the church.